Eileen and Thomas Lonergan were a married couple obsessed with two things: scuba diving and each other. After 2 years of travelling the world, their final stop was at the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, a bucket list activity for millions, and they were going to experience it together. But what should have been a once-in-a-lifetime experience went tragically wrong. As the couple were swimming, their scuba crew sailed away without them, abandoning them in the middle of the great wide ocean. The diving company responsible failed to even notice that Tom and Eileen were missing until 2 whole days later. It's been over 25 years since their mysterious disappearance, and we have very little in the way of evidence to try to figure out what happened to them. Only a desperate SOS message they scrawled on a slate and tried to send back to land, praying that they would be rescued. But when their wetsuits washed up on the shore months later without Tom and Eileen in them, it put a very eerie spin on this mystery. Had they reached land and taken their suits off? Were they alive? Or had they removed their suits in the middle of the ocean as a result of delirium, exhaustion, or dehydration? Well, that's what we're going to try to figure out in this episode. So thank God it's Freaky Friday. Today we're uncovering the story of Eileen and Thomas Lonergan, the lovers forever lost at sea. This series is intended for educational purposes, to document mysteries, historical events, and amplify important conversations. All opinions stated are mine alone. Before we get into today's episode of Freaky Friday, I want to thank our sponsor for making this video possible, Love and Pies. A lot of you guys might know that I am a mobile game girly. I am a self-confessed mobile gameaholic, and I've been loving Love and Pies for years at this point, and I have worked so hard on my cafe. I have so many rooms unlocked. It's really cute, if I do say so myself. I just think it's such a cute game with so many bright colours, and it's just so wholesome and sweet, and that's exactly what I need, honestly. After a long day of researching these weird, freaky cases, I need some escapism. So let me show you this world that I have been spending so much time in lately. Basically, the aim of the game is to match up different ingredients to be able to create different baked goods and pies. Love and Pies! I love it when they say the name of the movie in the movie. You sell these pies and cakes and different things to your customers, and you get tips, and then you use that money to be able to upgrade and decorate your cafe. And honestly, it starts out tiny and run down and a bit broken, and you've already seen mine. Mine is slaying now. It's just so satisfying to rebuild it and customize it and watch it grow and watch all the storylines unfold at the same time. Which actually brings me to one of the things that I love the most about this game, is how inclusive it is with its characters and its storylines. All kinds of love and all kinds of people are represented in this game, which I think is just so important. We talk about that kind of thing a lot when it comes to movies and adverts, but even in mobile games, diversity and inclusivity is so important. And to make things even more fun, Love and Pies have a special treat for you girlies. If you download Love and Pies using my link and then play up until day 3, you will get an amazing free gift in the in-game inbox messages. That's 200 energy and 50 gems. And trust me, you will see once you start playing just how valuable all of those items are. So if you're anything like me and you want to escape into a sweet little world of love and pies, then you can download Love and Pies for free on iOS and Android today. Thanks again to Love and Pies for sponsoring this video. I love that game. Now, before we get into the content of the episode, I do just want to give you a warning. We're going to be covering a lot of sensitive topics today, including suicide and suicidal ideation. And I would also say, if you've got a fear of open water, then I would gently suggest that maybe this video isn't for you, but you know, viewer discretion is always advised. But now it's time to dive into a scuba mystery that will occupy your mind for at least a week after you've tuned into this episode. The story begins in 1998 in Port Douglas, a fairly quiet diving and sailing town in Queensland, Australia. Port Douglas is a pretty laid-back place. It's got a load of beach resorts and hotels. It's super popular with tourists in the summer because from Queensland you can get to the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is iconic. It's unlike anywhere else in the world. It contains the world's largest collection of coral reefs with 400 types of coral and 1,500 different species of fish. And the views from underwater are insane. I've heard. I mean, I wouldn't know. I'm scared of the ocean. You're not going to get me down there. Because apparently you can see things up close like killer whales. It has the word killer in the name, guys. But for many people, diving and exploring and swimming around the Great Barrier Reef is one of the most incredible experiences they will ever have. But this beautiful part of the world is also dying. Climate change is slowly killing and bleaching huge parts of the reef. After 25 million years, this lively ecosystem is fading away piece by piece. In 2016, half of the Great Barrier Reef had already died. Imagine the coral that was once so full of life and colour is now nothing but ghostly white skeletons swaying beneath the waves. It's as if the ocean has become a graveyard. Now, bleached corals aren't actually dead, but they are much more likely to starve or catch disease. If there's even a 1 degree Celsius temperature change in the water for 4 weeks, that causes the coral to start bleaching. And if the water stays warm for too long, like 8 weeks or more, then the corals will start to die. The Great Barrier Reef's beauty does still exist today, but time is running out to see it as it once was, the way that Eileen and Thomas Lonergan saw it in 1998. At the time of this case, Tom was 33 and Eileen was 28. They were young and completely and utterly in love. In fact, they were basically inseparable. Tom's mum said, "We used to laugh at them, how they would do everything together." And they actually made everyone around them want what they had. They'd originally met while they were both attending Louisiana State University. They met, they fell head over heels, and they were actually married while they were still in uni. So by the time of this case, they'd been together for 10 years. They'd both been born and raised in Louisiana, and they hadn't ventured out of there very much. But they both did have a real thirst for adventure and a longing to help others. So for this reason, the two of them ended up joining the Peace Corps together. For us non-Americans, the US Peace Corps is basically a volunteer program where Americans are sent out to work abroad on community-based projects and education, and basically just helping other countries in any way that they need. And it's basically all done with the aim of promoting world peace and friendship. Tom and Eileen had travelled all over the Pacific Islands as part of their work with the Peace Corps, but their main job had been teaching underprivileged children in Fiji. They went to so many different, tiny little islands in the middle of the ocean that had populations as small as 10,000 people. Could you imagine living on a tiny little island being separated from the other 8 billion people out there in the world? At the time of this case, Tom and Eileen had come to the end of their work with the Peace Corps and they were ready to head back to America. But they decided first they were going to do a little pit stop in Queensland, Australia, specifically to see the Great Barrier Reef. The two of them had been keen scuba divers since university. It was actually Eileen that started first, and she loved it so much that she got Tom into it too. And now it was just something that they did together as a couple. They were very adventurous in a lot of different ways. They loved camping, hiking, bushwalking, basically anything outdoorsy. Little did Tom and Eileen know that this expedition to the Great Barrier Reef would be their final adventure. It was a sunny Sunday down under on January 25th, 1998, when Eileen and Tom boarded a group diving boat headed for the Great Barrier Reef. The couple had signed up to do a day trip with this company called Outer Edge, and they basically took groups of 26 people of varying diving abilities out into the ocean to go diving. Tickets cost 160 Aussie dollars, or just over £80, or just over $100. For that fee, the Outer Edge crew would take these groups of divers out to St. Crispin Reef, where they would do 3 separate dives, and this is about 40 miles away from the shore. There are so many different diving companies that operate there, and they've been doing it for years and years and years. They know the best and the most safe areas to go diving. They know exactly what they're doing. Or at least, You would hope that they know exactly what they're doing. At around 3 p.m. that day, the group were doing their third and final dive of the day. Essentially, the way that scuba diving works, I'm going to explain the whole process to you just so that you can kind of put yourself in the situation that they were in. So Outer Edge sails them 40 miles into the middle of the ocean. Everyone's in their wetsuits with all of their different equipment on their back. You go to the edge of the boat and you actually dive into the ocean backwards because with all that breathing equipment, it can actually damage it if you jump in forwards. I don't know the science. Again, I've never scuba dived and I'm never gonna after this case. Once the divers are in the water, they can go down anywhere between like 30 feet to 100 feet underwater, depending on what they're going to see. And honestly, it does look like a really nice experience if you're into that kind of thing. You can nosy at the fish, the coral looks amazing. There's certain parts where you can go like all the way to the ocean floor and just like walk through the corals as if it's like a flower garden. So they have their time scuba diving and exploring, and then someone on the boat, when it's time to leave, they'll blow this really sharp, noisy whistle, and apparently you're supposed to be able to hear it in the ocean. When this whistle blows, everyone gets out of the water, climbs back onto the boat, and then the boat takes them all 40 miles back to the shore. Scuba diving can be very dangerous, and there are a lot of different rules to follow. It's definitely not for beginners, this kind of thing anyway, in the Great Barrier Reef. You usually have to practice beforehand in an indoor pool for something like this. And there are so many different things that you need to know about and to take extra care around. For example, you have to come back up to the surface quite slowly. If you go too fast, a lot of science happens in your body that I'm gonna have to try and explain, aren't I? Basically, all the nitrogen gas inside the person would expand at such a rapid rate that you would end up with decompression sickness, or the bends as it's known. And it's basically caused by a rapid decrease in temperature that surrounds you, either in air or water, obviously in this case, and it can be extremely painful and at times actually life-threatening. So there's not only that to watch out for, but obviously you've also got a limited amount of oxygen out there in the ocean. So all in all, it's not exactly the safest sport that you could try. Things do have to be very strictly and carefully observed, otherwise lives are at risk. But like we said, you would think that professional scuba diving tours and companies that have been doing this for years would have all of that under control, right? So Tom and Eileen jumped off the boat and they went scuba diving. They went looking around all the corals. They were experiencing the Great Barrier Reef. This is something that is on so many people's bucket lists. It must have felt amazing. But then, when they came back up to the surface less than an hour later, the tour boat had gone. They looked around and there was absolutely no one. There was nothing. They were in the ocean all alone. And the thought of them coming back up to the surface and seeing that just makes my stomach drop, because what do you mean the boat has gone? And that realization that you're 40 miles away from the shore, you are in the middle of the vast ocean, and there's nothing you can really do. You can't call for anyone, there's no one around. How the hell are you gonna get back? While the ocean is beautiful in pictures or for a day at the beach, it's totally different when you're 40 miles away from the shore and there is absolutely nothing around. In that case, it is literally just a terrifyingly huge expanse of water and nothing else. Plus, the seas around Australia are home to some of the biggest and most dangerous sharks in the world. It was just Tom, Eileen, the deep, deep waters that surrounded them, and whatever might be lurking beneath. Can you imagine that kind of silence? Well, it's not silence, there's nothing but crashing waves around you, but no other humans. They probably would have tried to cry out for help, but you would hear nothing back other than your own voice. It is the stuff of nightmares, but it's not necessarily a deadly disaster yet, at least not at this point. You would hope that the boating company would realise that they were 2 passengers short and they would turn the hell around and get back for them. But hours and hours went by and nothing. no one came. We don't know what Tom and Eileen would have been thinking or doing at this point in time, but we can look to stories of survivors of very similar situations to figure out what one might do to try to stay alive. There was one British tourist that actually survived for 40 hours in stormy Australian seas until he was eventually washed ashore on this tiny uninhabited island. Lucky for him, this island that he had washed up on randomly was only 3 miles off the shore of the mainland, so he was rather quickly spotted by a cruise ship and he was rescued. But for 40 hours, that is almost 2 whole days, this man had been starving, freezing, and terrified. He honestly thought he was gonna die out in the ocean. But he was incredibly lucky to have been washed ashore. So clearly, miracles can happen, but Tom and Eileen were 40 miles out and there were no islands around them that they could wash up on. But the two of them were probably in a better position to survive than most people, I'd think. Remember, they were young, fit, experienced divers. Besides, when you go scuba diving, you wear this thing called a buoyancy compensator. And it's not exactly a life jacket, because if they were wearing a life jacket, they'd never be able to dive under the water. But these buoyancy compensators give you just enough support that if you're treading water at the surface, you're not gonna get dragged down. It basically helps you stay afloat. So that made drowning less likely for Tom and Eileen, but the real danger came from the deadly blazing heat of the tropical Queensland sun. Without fresh water, someone floating in the middle of the ocean might dehydrate before help can find them. But even though I've made it all sound so scary, I can only imagine that at this point, after it's only been an hour or two, Tom and Eileen would be pretty confident that the boat is going to realise that they're missing and it's going to come back for them before anything bad or too bad can happen. After all, scuba divers are supposed to be logged in and out of the water, and notes are supposed to be taken as to how deep they went, where they went, what kind of air levels are in the tanks when they get back. There's a lot of documentation that needs to be done, so surely it's not going to be long until they realise. But arguably the most important protocol of these scuba diving tours is that they do a head count. When everyone gets back on the boat after they've been out diving, they count every passenger that is on there before they sail away to make sure that they have everyone. But on the outer edge that day, no one seemed to have noticed that Tom and Eileen never returned to the boat after their final dive. The 5 crew members on the boat were serving food at this point, and all the other divers were discussing the incredible experience that they'd just had, and no one noticed the 2 unattended dive bags belonging to the missing Americans. Apparently, there was a head count on the outer edge after that final dive, but clearly it was wrong. Clearly someone can't count to 26. Tom and Eileen were left stranded in the middle of the ocean with less than 5 hours of daylight left, and no one was coming back for them. A heartbreaking realisation that was made in the aftermath of this case was that there were actually a couple of pontoons only a mile or 2 away from where Tom and Eileen had been abandoned. A pontoon is basically a flattish boat that's meant to be super, super buoyant so that you can get on it and walk around or tie other boats to it. It's like a little raft, like a floating raft. In fact, they're often used by these scuba tour thingies to tie the boat to while everyone's jumping off. And there were a couple of these not far away from Tom and Eileen. They probably could have swam to them and climbed to relative safety and waited there for help. But that didn't happen. Honestly, we don't know if they could even see the pontoons from where they were in the water. I guess it's hard enough to see 2 miles away on land, never mind in the water when you're constantly bobbing up and down. And ocean currents are strong as well. That's one thing that really freaks me out about this is even when you're swimming at the beach, you have to be careful not to go too far out into the sea, otherwise you'll get swept away. So imagine what it's like 40 miles out into the ocean. And plus, in the summer, the strong winds make the tidal currents so strong. The waters around Port Douglas can be really unpredictable. There are strong rips and undercurrents that Tom and Eileen will have been constantly struggling against. Obviously, we have no idea what was going through Tom and Eileen's brain brains at this point in time, but I can imagine that most people in this situation would be very panicked, but with an overall sense that surely things will be fine in the end. They will be rescued and apologized to and probably get a bit of compensation for this, because obviously something had gone horrifically wrong, but you would hope that it would be fixed. After all, their belongings were still on that boat. Something that would hopefully remind everyone that was on board that two people hadn't made it back. But again, this didn't happen. Everyone got off the boat at the end of the day and went home that night without a single thought for Tom and Eileen. And the very next day, it was business as usual for Outer Edge. They took another group of 26 passengers out into the Great Barrier Reef. Like, surely they would have seen those unaccompanied bags by now. They would have gone on the next morning and been like, shit, whose are those? But we don't know if anyone saw or noticed these bags because no alarms were raised yet. But it's not like the signs weren't screaming in their faces. For example, one diver in this new group on the second day went down into the ocean, and when they came back up, they told one of the crew members on board Outer Edge that they'd spotted a bunch of dive weights just sitting on the bottom of the ocean floor. Oblivious to what had happened the day before, the crew member actually saw this discovery of these spare dive weights as a lucky bonus. They'd just come across a bunch of free equipment. But if you thought about it for any longer than a minute, like, are you not going to start questioning where those dive weights actually came from? Because they've got to be someone's. Unless they thought that they'd just like fallen off a boat or something like that. But it seemed that those dive weights were Tom and Eileen's equipment. These weights are actually used to counteract the buoyancy of the oxygen that they will have been carrying. And it seems that Tom and Eileen had discarded these weights, possibly in a desperate attempt to stay alive and stay afloat as long as they could. But the point is, even now, on this next day, when the weights were found, Tom and Eileen could have still been alive and treading water and waiting for help. But while they were fighting to stay alive, another diving group was just living it up in the same deep blue that they were abandoned in. And it is such a crying shame that that crew member didn't consider those abandoned dive weights to be anything out of the ordinary or anything suspicious, because that could have raised the alarm that would have saved Tom and Eileen. But again, no alarms were raised. It actually wasn't until the day after that that Outer Edge finally realised that they had lost two people out at sea. Tom and Eileen hadn't been seen since their final dive on Sunday around 3 p.m, and now it was Tuesday evening. It was actually the owner of Outer Edge that raised the alarm in the end. He was also the skipper of the boat, which is kind of like the captain. He went on board on Tuesday evening and he noticed the unattended bags, and he didn't worry too much. He just thought that someone from the group on that day had just left their bags over. So he went over to this bag and opened it to try and see if there was any form of identification in there, so then he could maybe get these belongings back to the rightful owner. But when he opened it, we have a quote from him. He said, "I looked in the bag and thought, Jesus Christ, it's got a wallet and papers in it." And there was also a t-shirt in this bag that the skipper thought he recognised as one that one of the divers was wearing on Sunday. It turns out that was Tom's t-shirt. It was Tom's belongings. So it wasn't until this point, 51 hours after Tom and Eileen were last seen, their disappearance was finally reported to the police by the skipper of the boat. And they immediately realised just how horrifying and very serious this situation was. They called in reinforcements before they even started searching, because they just knew that their numbers weren't enough to handle a case of this magnitude. In fact, police numbers in Port Douglas actually tripled just for this investigation to try and find these two missing tourists. This investigation was already a huge deal, and I bet Outer Edge as a company were shitting themselves at this point in time, because, well, it was obvious that the company had been negligent. In order for this situation to have even happened, there was an incorrect head count. Even if Tom and Eileen were discovered and rescued and they were alive and they were saved and everything was actually all right in the end, Outer Edge would still be in a hell of a lot of trouble. But that would be the best case scenario. They were desperately hoping that police and Coast Guards and whoever else was out there diving, literally everyone that lived in Port Douglas and owned a boat joined in on this search. There were so many volunteers, and Outer Edge were just hoping and praying that Tom and Eileen would be found alive. But you know what they say about missing people, that the more time passes, the less and less likely they are to be found alive. The first 24 hours are absolutely crucial, and they had been and gone. In fact, the first 48 hours had been and gone. Everyone knew that this meant the chances of their survival were probably quite low at this point, but they weren't letting that get into their heads. Everyone knew that they just had to go out there and search and just try. There were so many aircrafts, helicopters sent out above the ocean to be looking down, and they actually had to quadruple their usual search grid because it had already been 2 days and Tom and Eileen could have been washed far, far out by now. But to be honest, at this point in time, search teams imagined that they were probably looking for 2 dead bodies. The ocean is just so vast. This felt like a huge impossible task. How on earth were they going to find 2 people across 5 million kilometers squared of deep water? Just for some context, that is twice the size of India. So search teams were already losing hope that they'd even be able to search the whole entire thing, never mind get there in time to save the couple. Both air and sea rescue teams spent 3 whole days non-stop searching. Like I said, loads of normal civilians were volunteering to be part of the searches, the Navy was going out, literally anyone and everyone with a boat. But then they had a slight break in the case. Some evidence had washed ashore. It was a diving slate with a message scrawled on it. Now, diving slates are usually used for divers to be able to communicate with each other underwater when they obviously can't talk. They can write messages. On one side of this slate were loads of scribblings about technical diving matters, and that side was actually identified as being Tom's handwriting. And then on the other side was a harrowing, desperate SOS message. Tom and Eileen had used this diving slate to try to call for help. It was dated 8 a.m. on the 26th of January, so the day after they went missing, and it read, "To anyone who can help us, we have been abandoned on Agincourt Reef, 25th of Jan, 1998, 3 p.m. Please help us. Come to rescue us before we die. Help." And that is honestly one of the most harrowing things I've ever heard. It just gives me a pit in my stomach to know that they were out there panicking, knowing that they only had a little bit of time left. Searches continued, but very little progress was made. There was no sign of Tom or Eileen or any more of their belongings. A whole month went by, and at this point, everyone had run out of hope. Even Tom and Eileen's family were coming to terms with the fact that they were never going to see their loved ones again. But the next development came around that 1 month mark when a wetsuit washed up onto the shores of Queensland. It had barnacles growing all over it, so it wasn't freshly lost. It had been out there floating for quite some time. It was immediately theorised that this could have been Tom or Eileen's wetsuit. It was, of course, pulled from the shore and taken for examination, and the sizing of it seemed to match up to Eileen. And marine experts were actually able to figure out how long the wetsuit had been floating in the sea by how barnacled up it was. They determined that barnacles had been latching onto this wetsuit since January 26th, the day after Tom and Eileen disappeared. So Eileen had taken off her wetsuit, maybe? After 2 days of floating and panicking, it seemed she'd stripped naked. But why? Experts have speculated that while the couple were drifting helplessly under the blazing heat of the tropical sun, they may have become dehydrated and therefore delirious, and ended up taking off their wetsuits for no logical reason. And there's also a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing that happens when people are practically about to die of hypothermia. They suddenly start to feel very hot, which is a false feeling because obviously they've got hypothermia, they are freezing cold, but suddenly their body starts to feel like it's burning and they're sweating and they just need to strip off every piece of clothing to try to cool down. And I've tried to look into like if this is possible, because hypothermia obviously happens when you're super freezing cold, but it was blazing heat in Queensland at that point in time. It seems that the Great Barrier Reef is actually always pretty damn warm, especially at the time that they would have been there. It would have been about 29 degrees Celsius in the sea. Hypothermia starts to become a worry when water temperatures dip below 15 degrees Celsius. So even during the night when the sun had gone down, I can't imagine the sea would have gotten cold enough for Tom and Eileen to get hypothermia. But people don't necessarily have to be dying of hypothermia to just become delusional and take their clothes off. Maybe the dehydration and exhaustion could just be an explanation for that. A few weeks after the wetsuit washed up, along came 2 inflatable dive jackets that were marked with Tom and Eileen's names. This was swiftly followed by their oxygen tanks that were actually still buoyed up by a tiny bit of oxygen left in them. And finally, the last piece of evidence that washed up on the shore was one of Eileen's fins. And that is all they ever found of Tom and Eileen Lonergan. To this very day, we still have no idea where their bodies are or what happened to them in their final 2 days lost at sea. They were so young and in love, and they had the rest of their lives ahead of them, but now all of that had vanished into the depths of the ocean. With the discovery of Eileen's wetsuit, a clear story or a theory began to emerge. Wetsuits are made to be quite buoyant, and so are the dive jackets that also washed up on the shore. They help to keep the diver afloat when they're at the surface. If Eileen, and presumably Tom too, had taken off their wetsuits and their dive jackets for whatever reason, they suddenly no longer have that extra buoyancy to keep them afloat. And since we've already worked out that they would have taken these suits off after already being out there for pretty much a whole day, we can imagine at that point they were already quite exhausted and dehydrated. They weren't doing well. I can imagine if they were feeling so exhausted, they could have really done with that additional buoyancy, but now that they'd taken off their dive jackets and their wetsuits, they were going to really struggle to stay afloat. Eventually, the police were forced to give up the search, believing that the couple had died within a few days of being abandoned by Outer Edge. And at this point in time, obviously they're like over a month out, nearly 2 months out, there would be no bodies left to find. In fact, I'll tell you exactly what I think happened to Tom and Eileen, although it might be a bit grim, even for this channel. I think that they died of dehydration or exhaustion or drowning or some combination of those. And I think after they died, their corpses remained floating on the water for a couple of days. That whole time, I imagine their bodies will have been picked apart by fish and birds. In fact, experts say that it would take scavenging sea creatures no longer than 2 weeks to dismember and eat a human body, leaving nothing but the bones. The bones would sink to the ocean floor and either get picked apart further down there, or they would just be covered over by silt and never seen again. But not everyone believes this theory. In fact, the internet has taken this case and ran with it. Of course, fork found in kitchen. But the first one I want to talk about is actually quite believable, maybe. I'm sure some of you have already thought this while I've been telling this story, and that's that it could have maybe been a shark attack. When you hear the bare bones of this case, it does seem like it could be likely. They were 40 miles out in the middle of the ocean. Australia is covered in sharks. Well, the seas are covered in sharks. But once the evidence started washing ashore, like the wetsuit and the buoyancy devices and dive jackets, there were no bite marks in any of it. The wetsuit actually was pretty ripped up, but experts have looked at it and said that they don't think those are teeth marks. They think it's just where the wetsuit had gotten like caught on corals and just been ripped. And besides, even though half the world's sharks live in the waters around Australia, most of them are completely harmless to humans. But that is a proper mad fact though, isn't it? That half the world's sharks are just surrounding Australia. Good luck, Charlie. And I know they're mostly harmless, but what is it about Australian creatures? They have some of the most horrifying sounding little creepy crawlies ever. If it's not sharks, then it's spiders. If it's not spiders, then it's snakes. If it's not snakes, then it's the stingray that killed Steve Irwin. In fact, Steve Irwin literally died whilst filming a show at the Great Barrier Reef. It's one of the most beautiful places on Earth, or under Earth, and it's so blooming deadly. Well, obviously these are all freak accidents that I've mentioned in this video. Please don't let it put you off of visiting and experiencing all the beautiful things that this planet has to offer. Honestly, if you think about anything for too long, it could become terrifying, so let's not do that. Let's move on. Another theory that the internet insists has some weight to it that I don't believe is that Tom and Eileen faked their deaths. I personally find these kind of theories about people faking their deaths kind of disrespectful because, well, they're dead. They're dead. You hear shit like this all the time with celebrities, which I guess, whatever, like people think that Tupac faked his death and is just like sat on an island sipping a cocktail right now. But be fucking for real, he's not. People die. Tom and Eileen didn't have any reason to want to fake their deaths. They loved their lives, they loved each other. They were literally just taking one last vacation together before returning home to their families, who they hadn't really seen in the last 2 years. They were experiencing one of the great wonders of the world, ticking something off of their bucket list. Why would they then take that opportunity to fake their death? Like, even if they did have a reason to want to fake their death, why would you choose this most elaborate way possible? When people believe this theory, do they think that Outer Edge was in on it? That they helped Tom and Eileen to fake their deaths? Because they were the ones that abandoned them. They were the ones that did the incorrect head count. For me personally, this theory has no weight to it, but people believe it because there were a few different Australians in the days after Tom and Eileen's disappearance that called the police saying that they thought they'd seen them. There were sightings of Tom and Eileen. Someone thought they'd seen them in a bookstore, someone thought they'd seen them checking into a hotel, but I don't know if police even bothered to look into these things, but nothing was ever found. This kind of thing happens way too often with mysterious cases like these, or true crime cases. People want to be involved in it to the point where they start spreading misinformation, claiming to have seen people, or even intentionally trying to create a hoax situation. But the fact of the matter is, there is no actual evidence that Tom and Eileen had planned in advance to fake their deaths. Well, I guess that's supposed to be the idea, isn't it? When someone's faking their death, they don't leave any evidence behind, but there would be tiny clues if you were to really look hard for them. You would be able to figure it out. Things like large transactions disappearing from their bank account in the run-up to their faked deaths. Because honestly, if Tom and Eileen had faked their deaths, they'd left all their passport, all their money, they had nothing. They had no means to create a new life anywhere else. And they would have needed an accomplice as well. They would have needed someone else to come along in another boat to pick them up and take them to start their new life. But again, I just don't believe any of this. It's too far-fetched. But then there's another theory that Tom and Eileen had carried out a suicide pact together. It sounds totally out of nowhere, right? This completely loved up couple wanting to end their lives together. But when Tom and Eileen's diaries were discovered and read, they revealed a lot of secrets. On August 3rd, less than 6 months before that fateful trip, Tom had written in his diary, "Like a student who has finished an exam, I feel that my life is complete and I am ready to die. As far as I can tell, from here, my life can only get worse. It has peaked and it's all downhill from here until my funeral." Which is really upsetting to hear. I mean, you don't need me to tell you that. This is a 32-year-old guy that seems to have everything on the surface, but feels like there's no point to living anymore. And his wife, Eileen, knew about Tom's suicidal ideation, and she'd written about it in her own diary. Just 2 weeks before their trip, she wrote, "Tom's not suicidal, but he's got a death wish that could lead him to what he desires, and I could get caught in that." So it wasn't like Tom was actively seeking out death, but he was ready for it to come soon. And that last little bit of Eileen's diary entry just gives me the chills, and I could get caught in that. Oh my god. She also wrote in her diary about how their 2 years of traveling and working together in the Peace Corps, how that had affected their relationship. She said, "Our lives are so entwined now, and we are hardly two individuals. I am still Eileen, but I am mostly Eileen and Tom. He is mostly Tom and Eileen. Where we are now goes beyond dependence, beyond love." Everyone in their lives saw Tom and Eileen as this perfect, loved up, happy couple. But I guess this goes to show that you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. I personally don't think that these diary entries are related to their deaths whatsoever. I think, honestly, this is the most elaborate suicide pact theory I've ever seen the internet come up with. But what is clear is that Tom was depressed, and it's heartbreaking that the universe granted his wish to die young. But in spite of all of these elaborate theories, I think the truth of the matter is that the crew on the Outer Edge boat that day were negligent to the point of Tom and Eileen's unfortunate deaths. The desperate SOS message that was scrawled on that diving slate is enough evidence for me to believe that Tom and Eileen wanted to survive this, but they tragically succumbed to dehydration, exhaustion, or drowning. This whole incident was so avoidable, to the point where Outer Edge was actually taken to court over the whole thing, and the ship captain, Jack, was actually charged with the unlawful killing of Eileen and Tom. His role as the captain of that boat is to be vigilant, and he should be the one in charge of everyone's safety. Jack swore that he had ordered one of the other crew members to do a head count after that final dive. But he says that the numbers must have just gotten confused because 2 passengers actually jumped into the water in the middle of the head count, so it must have just mixed up his numbers. But okay, if you got confused, then just do a recount. It's that simple. It's not like they were in a rush to get back to the shore. Just take the extra 10 seconds to start over. You're only counting to 26, and when people's safety and clearly their lives are at risk, why wouldn't you just start over? But anyway, Outer Edge Captain Jack was actually acquitted by Australia's Supreme Court in 1999, but his business, Outer Edge, wasn't so lucky. The company pled guilty to negligence because, someone had to be at fault for their deaths, even if it wasn't Captain Jack directly. Outer Edge were fined a huge amount. I don't actually know how much, but it was so much that they just had to pack it in altogether. He had to file for bankruptcy. He couldn't afford that fine, never mind to try to rebuild his business after something so damaging. In the aftermath of this incident, there are now much stricter government regulations when it comes to scuba diving in Queensland. There are so many more rules, and now there are head count confirmations, which I hope that makes people feel a little bit better if you are wanting to go scuba diving in the Great Barrier Reef. As I said earlier, please don't let this case put you off. I always think in the aftermath of such horrific, tragic freak accident kind of things like this, then safety measures are always even safer than before. Because things are changed, weaknesses are found and fixed. And I like to think this way because I like the Smiler roller coaster. You know, the roller coaster crash video that we did not long ago? I've been on that since. The whole time I was in the queue on the way around, I was like, it's fine, it's gonna be fine, they've fixed it, it's gonna be so safe. This is probably even the safest roller coaster in this whole theme park. It's trying to brainwash myself to be okay. But since we've gotten into the swing of highlighting important charities in the ends of these episodes, let's continue that, shall we? For this episode, since Tom and Eileen were so passionate about the ocean and seeing its greatest wonders, I wanted to highlight a cause that is dedicated to protecting it. Because sadly, much of what they saw on their final dive has now vanished into the depths of the ocean as well. Coral reefs are some of the most biologically diverse ecosystems on Earth, and they are seriously suffering because of climate change. If coral reefs go extinct, this will have catastrophic consequences, not only for marine life, but also for human life. It's estimated that 100 million people could die by 2030 because of climate change. And this summer, the Great Barrier Reef suffered its worst summer on record. So every little bit helps. helps. You can make a difference by donating to the Reef Rescue Appeal at the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. Your support will help to protect and restore these precious reefs. In 2003, a film called Open Water was made, which is like loosely based on the tragic events of that day. I'm sure some of you have been thinking in your head this whole time, why does this story seem quite familiar? But even still, to this day in 2024, this mystery still remains unsolved, and we've never actually had any concrete evidence to say what actually happened to Tom and Eileen. And the most disturbing part of all of this is that the two of them would have likely suffered a very slow and scary death. With each second that passed, they would have realised more and more that that boat wasn't coming back for them. And that is all we have for this episode of Freaky Friday. Thank you so much for tuning in. This was a bit of a different one. We've never done like a sea mystery before, so you'll have to let us know in the comments what you thought to this one. As always, we're open to requests for the Freaky Friday series and for true crime series, so leave any suggestions down in the comments. And thanks again to Love and Pies for sponsoring this video. You guys know I love them. If you download the game using my link and then play up until day 3, you'll get an amazing gift in-game. You'll get 200 energy and 50 gems, which is, it's worth a lot in this economy, girl. So go to the description down below to download the game for free on iOS and Android. Thank you so much everyone for tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below or a comment. Engaging with this video in some kind of way tells YouTube that you enjoyed it, and then it'll push it out to more people, and we will all be very happy on the Eleanor and Neale team. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Oh, if you want to watch another one of my videos, there'll be one on screen right now. Or if you want to subscribe to my channel, click the circle with my face in, and you can also put notifications on so you never miss when we upload a video. Wouldn't that be perfect? But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!